2024. Tonight, joined by an esteemed panel that includes the former Vice Chairperson of the IEC, Mr. Tselane, Constitutional Law and Municipal Law expert advocate Mark Oppenheimer, and the President of Action SA, Herman Mashaba, who are the conveners of this webinar, we will ventilate some of the key issues that arise from this suggestion. Our questions have been solicited from various members of the public. For the media who may be joining us this evening, high-resolution recordings of these proceedings will be made available upon request. With further ado, let us kick this evening off with opening remarks from you, Mr. Mashaba.
Thank you very much, Lerato, and good evening, South Africa. And thank you to all of you who are joining us this evening. A special word of welcome to Mr. Tselane, a former senior executive at the IEC, including advocate Mark Oppenheimer, constitutional law expert. I appreciate you making the time, gentlemen, to joining us this evening to engage us on this very important topic. I remember the first time I voted as a Black South African in 1994. I remember it like it was actually yesterday. It was a day that I did not believe that I would really see it in my life. Voting for Nelson Mandela's ANC in 1994 and witnessing the relatively peaceful transition to democracy was a profound and proud moment for all of us, especially the previously disenfranchised who could not vote during the apartheid years. For the first time in my life, I felt like a true South African citizen. While my vote has since changed, I still hold the electoral process and our democratic right to cast our vote to be the most important right we have as South Africans. Regular elections, as defined in our constitution, are in fact the most basic prerequisite for a democratic system to function. This do not only provide our elected leaders with a public mandate to govern, but they also allow us as citizens to hold elected officials to account and remove them from public office when they do not perform. It is for this reason that when I first heard of the suggestion to postpone the 2021 local government elections, that I grew deeply concerned for our young democracy. Let me be clear. I fully appreciate the unprecedented impact that COVID-19 pandemic has had on all of everything. Many of us, my family included, have lost loved ones, not to mention our frontline workers who must brave the often compromising condition they face every day in our hospitals and clinics. Having said that, I still believe that elections can be held and be held safely. Just a few months ago, a record 155 million US citizens cast theirs, despite the country being one of the worst hit. They understand that regular elections are sacrosanct in the context of a democratic freedom. I understand that if they are not managed correctly, elections have the potential to be a super spreader event for this virus. However, we cannot allow parties such as the ANC and the EFF to use COVID-19 pandemic as an excuse to deny South Africans the right to vote. The motives underlying this call have nothing to do with protecting South African voters, but everything to do with protecting the political self-interest of these political parties. Over the past year, we have seen the worst of the ANC and the EFF. We have seen the ANC loot COVID relief funding, profit from dodgy PPE tenders, and fail to prepare our healthcare system for the onslaught of this disease. We have seen the EFF's racist calls grow louder and openly encourage lawlessness and illegal immigration. These values are not shared by the majority of South Africans. The majority of our people are peaceful and law-abiding people who reject racism, extremism, and criminality. I believe that the call to postpone elections stems from the fear of the possible voter rejection by those who have called for such postponement. None of us can profess to know what the situation with the pandemic will be like by October this year, when elections will likely be held. If those who are calling for the postponement of elections were truly committed to our democracy, they would be working with the IEC to ensure that we can hold elections and hold them safely. Resorting to calling for the delay is both irrational and dangerous to our hard-won democracy. That is why we have convened this webinar this evening to create awareness about this impending threat. We cannot allow everything we fought for with blood, sweat, and tears to be taken away by self-serving political interest. On that note, I would like to hand back to Lerato to facilitate the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those remarks, Mr. Mashaba. Advocate Oppenheimer, let me kick off with you. Calls first by the ANC SGS Mahashule and later EFF CIC Julius Malema to have this year's local government elections postponed have sparked an interest, but an interesting but concerning questions around whether or not constitutionally this is possible. Can you just take us through? I mean, are we having this conversation for naught, or is this possible? Can they do this?
Okay, well, I think it's worth starting off by looking at what the Constitution says in its current form. So, first of all, if you look at Section 1 of our Constitution, which has got a sort of super protection, if you want to change Section 1 of the Constitution, you require 75% of Parliament to change it. And it talks about the founding values of South Africa. And so the founding values are values like non-racialism, non-sexism, but one of them is this commitment to democracy. And so if we see Section 1D, it's this idea of universal adult suffrage. So Herman has spoken about this pivotal moment in South Africa where everyone was able to vote, that all adults were given this right to vote, that we also have a common voters roll. But importantly for our purposes is this idea of regular elections. So a call to say that elections should be held on an irregular date, and the call from what I understand is for it to be postponed by a period of 3 years, would be a breach of Section 1 of the Constitution. Now, the specifics of how elections are to proceed are dealt with in other parts of the Constitution as well. So Section 159 talks specifically about municipal elections, and the idea is that they must be held every 5 years, and there is room for some deviation. So the idea is that there may be some reason why you can't get it down to the day, and so there is a 90-day postponement period that could be accommodated for. But elections must happen regularly with every 5 years, and the language that's used is that the council that is elected and those elected representatives through that council, like mayors, their term expires after the 5 years. And unless you change the Constitution, this means that all those elected officials would no longer have a mandate to govern because the Constitution says that their term is limited to 5 years.
Great, thank you for that. Dr. Tselane, you are the former vice chairperson of the IEC. You have a firm grasp on the importance of elections in a constitutional democracy like ours. In your view, what would be the impact of delaying local elections this year for South Africa's young democracy?
Perhaps let me start where Mark left off. The legislation is very clear in terms of the term of office of a municipal council. Section 159 of the Constitution says that no more than 5 years, and that the elections must happen within 90 days after the date of the last elections. Municipal Structures Act, Section 24, also emphasizes the fact that the term of office is 5 years, and that the minister, after consultation with the commission, can then make a determination of the date of the elections. But that determination must still be within 90 days after the date of the last elections. Now, of course, the Constitution and the legislation does anticipate moments when there could be postponement. Local Government Municipal Electoral Act does refer to the issue of postponement. Section 8 of the Local Government Municipal Electoral Act indicates that the commission may request the minister to postpone the election under certain conditions, but still that postponement must happen not outside the period of 90 days after the date of the last elections. So the Constitution is very clear in terms of that. So if you therefore wish to postpone the elections, you're going to have to change the constitution in order to allow for that, because the piece of legislation that I've mentioned indicate the period within which the elections have got to take place. Now, here it's a case against postponement. One is that we should always stand the temptation of postponing an election, because democracy is far more important, to be postponed. And secondly, that the certain participation is a human right, and therefore there is a social contract between the voter and the government and all those who are elected. But the third aspect here is that those who do not have appetite to leave office get comfortable about extending their rule forever. But the last aspect is that those who, basically the voter does not have a recourse or reprieve, particularly those who are living in areas where there is corruption or lack of service delivery. Now, I have mentioned these issues as issues against postponement. I could talk about incidents where it is possible and necessary for postponement, but for now, I will stop here.
Okay, so leading on from that, you mentioned that political leaders, have their own motives around this. Mr. Mashaba, I believe would stand to agree. I mean, he's come out swinging around the fact that in his public statements, even in the address that he just gave us now, against the ANC and the EFF's calls for elections to be postponed to 2024. Mr. Mashaba, you've asserted that both parties have ulterior motives. Can you state and clear the air for the nation? What do you think those ulterior motives could be or are?
I think, Lerato, as I stated in my opening remarks, I think, from really what I read, the mood out there, it's actually the fear of these political parties to face the next elections, particularly as it relates to the ANC. As you are aware, over the last few elections, they've been getting one big hiding after the other. And you can expect the next ones, you're going to see bloodbath. And for me, that's really my reading. And I think from the EFF side, I just cannot really understand how one would want to put the country in a constitutional crisis by postponing elections. Because if you are saying you are postponing, but then who's going to be governing these municipalities without the mandate of the voters? Because we don't live in a monarch, we live in a constitutional democracy where for you to be in public office, you should really be there at the mandate of the voters. So I think for me, to a large extent, it's fear to face the next elections than anything else. Because if they were genuine about their motive, they should really be right now engaging the IEC to really look at the ways to manage this process, whether you run them through postal system or whatever, or on virtual or whatever way, or at the same time run them over a few days, whatever it is. I think this is the time when, if there are prophets, in fact, for me, it even worries me. Are these the political parties even prophets to be able to forecast the state of the pandemic by later this year? So I personally feel it's got to do more with the fear of facing the elections than the actual issue that they're expressing to be of concern to them.
Thank you, Mr. Mashaba. Mark, I want to come to you. Mr. Tselane did allude to the fact that, there would have to be some amendments, that, the Constitution, for example, could be amended in some way to accommodate for postponement of elections. However, he made one key important observation that I've noted here, to say that to postpone elections in such a fashion, particularly these upcoming elections, would mean that the voter, who's the most important stakeholder here, has little to no recourse, really, especially those who are in municipalities that are dysfunctional, for lack of a better expression. What would be the prospects be? I mean, there are other people, people within organizations, various organizations, who could take measures on behalf of the voter. What would be the prospects of something like a constitutional court challenge to changing the constitution and allow for the delay of these elections?
Well, so the first thing we've got to look at is, what are the current obligations? And the current obligations are that you have to have regular elections every 5 years. So if the constitution is not changed and no elections are held, then the litigation that will proceed will be based on the document as it stands, to say that there is an obligation to hold these elections, and you fail to do so, and then you could have a court mandate requiring the elections. The second case that's interesting would be, what could be done to change the constitution as it stands. So I gather that the EFF have proposed a private members bill to change the constitution so that they could merge the election dates. And they say partly in that news article that was flashed up on the screen that it's not only about COVID, that they like the idea of national elections and municipal elections being held simultaneously, but it would require a constitutional change. Now the question is, what would be the threshold for that change? So if we look at Section 74, it talks about the percentage that you need to make a change to the Constitution. As I pointed out, Section 1, which is seen as one of the more sacred elements of our Constitution, requires the 75%. So if you want to, remove the rule of law or non-racialism or regular elections, well, then you have to affect Section 71. And so the argument might be that if you are going to postpone elections for a period of 3 years, that it's not sufficient to use merely the 2/3 majority, which is used for the Bill of Rights and the rest of the Constitution, that you really have to do it to Section 1 as well. Now, we know that the ANC and the EFF could currently muster 2/3, but it's unlikely to be a sufficient amount of support to get to the 75%. So if, let's say, you had a change with only the 2/3, assuming that they could muster that support, then the kind of challenge that could be run would be to say, look, it's incoherent with Section 1 of the Constitution, and is an affront to the idea of regular elections, and therefore the change itself is unconstitutional. So that might be one of the kinds of challenges that could be run. The other thing that must be borne in mind is that if you are to change the Constitution, you have to go through a certain process. You can't just change it. So if we think about, calls to change Section 25 of our Constitution, the property rights section, this has been a process that is still ongoing, has taken many years, requires an enormous amount of public participation. The Constitution itself talks about a 30-day period before proposing the bill, before you can change. So it would be quite difficult to make the change in a period of time before the deadline. Now, from what I understand, the deadline to be our elections in 2016 were held in August, which means that the earliest they could start this year would be in August, and I think the latest is November. So there is a sort of running clock on those parties that would like to change the Constitution. And obviously this public participation process is enormously important. On that second question about, well, is there some value in consolidating the elections? Would it be good if we could just, instead of going to the ballot box every 2 or 3 years, rather just go every 5? And I think the argument is that it's quite important in a democracy for the people to be heard regularly, and that the interests that they have on a local level are not the same kinds of interests that they have on a national level. So you might find, for example, that someone supports one party nationally, but supports a totally different party municipally. The sort of idea is, well, I trust these guys to, keep the roads working and keep the power on, but I want someone else coming up with the grand architecture of legislation on a national level. So that's quite important, that you do have this regular check and balance in the form of staggered elections. And that's mirrored in other countries. So if you look at America, they have an election every 2 years. So presidential elections are every 4 years, congressmen and women every 2 years, and senators are every 6. So you have this constant election. So you're constantly able to hold your, political leaders to account. And we would not be doing that if we pushed our election out by 3 years.
Mr. Mashaba, you have something to add?
In fact, yeah, if you had allow me, I think it's a really very important point that Mark actually raised, that for any democratic system to really be successful, it's important for civil society to hold government accountable. You can imagine if we've got to wait 5 years for politicians to hear us as civil society. I think in South Africa, we've got to really be grateful of the current constitutional framework that allows the voters out there every 2.5 years to actually send the message out to the politicians that we've had enough of you, or we still like you or not. So I think it's something that I would really urge all South Africans to really fight to ensure that every 2.5 years that we send a message out there to the politicians for them to understand that we want to really be heard. So I think really, as I say, I would like to really urge South Africans to ensure that we protect this fundamental right of our constitution.
Thank you for that. Let's talk about this a little bit more. I mean, we know that elections are quite a powerful mechanism in democratic societies. But is it the only one? Is it the only mechanism through which the electorate can be heard? Are there no, technically speaking, if this change were to happen, hypothetically speaking, it was to happen, elections do become postponed. Is that the only way that the public can be heard? Tselane, can you come in here?
Well, that is not the only way, even though it is the most important aspect of a democratic system. You could have, for instance, protests. You could have, people picketing to indicate, or petitioning public representatives to indicate their displeasure. But as I've indicated, that the electoral process and the process through which you elect a public representative, it's one of the most important aspects that cannot actually just be sacrificed willy-nilly. But I want to say this, that I do not say that you cannot actually postpone the elections at all, because even the legislation does recognize that under certain circumstances, you can postpone the elections. For instance, if there is serious instability, violence, and natural disasters, of course, you could actually, postpone the elections, but there's a process, as Mark has indicated, what process should actually be followed in order to be able to deal with those issues, the natural disasters and serious instability, violence, and all those aspects. But there is no system better than a system where you hold a public representative accountable than through an electoral process.
Mark, I saw you were nodding at the end. Thank you, Mr. Tselane, for those remarks. Mark, I saw you wanted to add something there before we move on.
Yes, I think we must think, democracies are not merely going to the ballot box, but the ballot box is an enormously important feature. And as Terry points out, it's also a steam valve. So if people aren't able to vote and show their displeasure, well, they're going to show their displeasure in other ways, and they may be very violent ways. So you may have people taking to the streets or storming Congress, as they've done in the States. So I think that there is that risk that the ANC and the EFF take by playing a game where you say, well, we'll remove your electoral rights for 3 years and assume that the populace will just abide. I mean, the populace may very well not abide, either through legal action or through other kinds of protests, some of which will not be peaceful protests. So that's worth bearing in mind. But there are other ways to hold politicians to account. And, we do see that we've got a sort of situation of lawfare at the moment, where a lot of actors feel that the way to settle disputes is through the courts, and the way to hold government to account is through the courts, and that the courts have played an enormous role in checking the other branches of government and holding the powerful to account, even to the extent of leading to the demise of a former president. So I think citizens mustn't sort of say, well, my only way of holding people to account is at the ballot box. There are other ways of having your voice heard, but the ballot box really does matter.
Great. Mr. Mashaba, I'm going to take one more from you before we move on. I'm always surprised. Of course, these conversations and the time just whisks on by. Go ahead, Mr. Mashaba.
Well, I think I just really want to follow up with what Terry and Mark said around other options for civil society to hold government accountable through protest and so forth. And I think, as South Africans, I think something that personally deeply hurts me is to see how many times civil society have to really, they have to take government to court to do what they're supposed to do constitutionally. They are forced by courts of law. It goes up to the Constitutional Court. I mean, we had this morning with the former president being the case having to go to a Constitutional Court, something that we as normal human beings, law-abiding ones, the ones who respect the rule of law, this matter should not have dragged on for so long. South Africa could ill afford the Zondo Commission. Can you imagine the Zondo Commission cost us almost R1 billion? Was it really necessary? If we're a country that believed in the rule of law, this billion rands, you can imagine how many houses one would have built, or the infrastructure that is collapsing, or right now building hospitals, clinics, training the doctors to deal with this pandemic. We should be using this money to buy the vaccines the vaccine that we so desperately need at this point in time.
Great. So let's move on to, I'm with a panel here that clearly agrees that elections should not be postponed. I think we can take what is coming out of this conversation to mean exactly that. We have touched on the fact that, for a constitutional democracy to be fully functional is for us to have these free and fair elections and have them frequently, so that the voter can can voice their opinions and also show the elected leaders as to their satisfaction or lack thereof of their performance. And that's at a time like this, surely the IEC now is probably at wit's end thinking about this is a COVID time, it's an unprecedented time. What should the IEC be doing at a time like this to prepare the nation for elections later on this year, August or so in 2021?
There are a few issues that they could be focusing on. But the first and the most important is factors that determine the integrity of the elections. What are those factors? Firstly, it is the quality of the voters' roll. They've got to make sure that those people who are supposed to be participating in various municipalities indeed belong to the municipalities where they're supposed to be participating. So they've got to clean up the voters' roll and make sure that the boundaries, the municipal boundaries, and people who belong to those municipalities and wards are indeed people who are registered in those areas. They've got to look at the issue of the addresses to make sure that indeed those people are located in the correct voting district. Having said the second one, it is basically the quality of the logistics. Remember that last time during 2019, IEC had some challenges of people who were alleged to have voted more than once. They should now be refining their systems to make sure that the quality of the logistics will not actually compromise them moving forward to the elections. The third important aspect is the issue of the quality of the electoral staff. They've got to be now training the electoral staff, making sure that they understand the legislation, they understand the rules, they understand the processes, and that they are able to deliver the elections that are free and fair. The fourth aspect, which determines the quality of the elections, is basically the political environment. Political environment meaning now having to interact with all the political players, making sure that parties that are represented in parliament and legislatures and those that are not represented are informed about the electoral processes and that they have regular conversation and discussions with them about what is expected of them, what is going to be happening, so that all of them can bind themselves to the code of conduct. But the last aspect is that because we are dealing with the environment of COVID, they should obviously be cooperating with the Department of Health to make sure that they are able to abide with COVID regulations going forward. The staff need to know exactly what kind of protocols have got to be followed, what they're supposed to be doing, and then making sure that they are in compliance with the COVID regulations and protocols.
Dr. Tselane, you are raising a couple of issues here that I see on my screen that some of our viewers are concerned about, and they want specific answers to this. But we spoke about, COVID. This is the reason why we're here. COVID is presenting a different set of circumstances. When we talk about, the ability to host elections in a time like COVID, do you have any examples? I mean, other countries we've seen they've had elections in the past year. Can you share with us some of the examples that are international where elections have been, held under such circumstances, just for South Africans to get a sense that, either or not, whether we can do it or not as well?
Well, there are many countries that actually had elections during COVID. But perhaps one of the most important countries, and I'm mentioning this country in particular because even during the war, they never actually postponed an election. The Republic of Korea. The Republic of Korea, in 1952, during the war, they continued with the electoral process, they continued with the elections. Even with COVID, in fact, the example is something that imitate what the Koreans have been able to achieve in terms of setting in place proper protocols to be able to deal with the COVID, whilst at the same time not sacrificing democratic processes.
What about the ballot? I mean, how were these held? Were people standing in queues? How were they casting their votes? How was the electorate able to do this?
Firstly, all the stations that were being used were sanitized. All the electoral staff were using PPEs, and that they, like in any situation, for instance, you've got a person that they call a queue worker in a voting station. That queue worker is the person who is very, very important because that person determines how the queue is managed. So in the case of Korea, that queue worker made sure that there was at least a social distancing between voters, that there was at least 1 meter between voters, and that those individuals who were whose temperatures were taken, if it was above the limit, they were taken to particular stations so that they do not actually infect other people. But also they had special votes for those people who were quarantined. So you had people who were being visited in the places where they are being quarantined to be able to participate in the electoral. So they observed all the protocols that you can actually think of. Every person there had to either wear the gloves or alternatively their hands were sanitized before they could touch anything related to the ballot or to a pen that is used at the voting station. And in most instances, they were actually asked to bring their own pen so that they use their own pens to be able to cast a vote. So those are some of the mechanisms that are put in place. And as I've suggested to you, the Republic of Korea, in fact, is exemplary in terms of how it has actually dealt with COVID. By the way, it dealt with the elections during hard lockdown, when it was very, very difficult for people to even have, any election. So they proceeded with their processes, and there is no evidence that, in fact, their elections, spread the coronavirus more than what they were already experiencing at that time.
Mark, you have anything to add? Other examples? I can see your facial expression says there's something burning that you want to share with our audience.
Well, I mean, I think Korea is such an excellent example to use. You can actually see the effect of democracy from space. So if you look at the Earth from space, you can see all the lights on in South Korea and no lights on in North Korea. North Korea, of course, has no democracy, has a dictatorship. So, these things have an effect. And as Terry points out, there are ways to run an election where you can ensure that people are safe. I think there is another thing worth bearing in mind, which is we have postponed our by-elections. And it's not because the IEC didn't feel that they could ensure that the voting process was in accordance with health and safety. It was that there's a regulation in place now which prohibits public gatherings. And I think if we talk about democracy as not just your vote at the ballot box, it's broader than that. It's about being able to exercise your civil and political rights. And part of that means the ability to go out and campaign, the ability to have public gatherings where you express support for one party or another party. And so I think if our elections are to be deemed free and fair, you would have to have a loosening of those sorts of restrictions, or you'd have to find some other way of ensuring that parties are able to get their ideas out. So, that more time is spent on television, on radio, online, so parties can get their ideas out.
So you just preempted my next question, and this is going to Mr. Mashaba. One of the issues or the concerns raised by Julius Malema in his press conference that he had, making the suggestion, was that these elections would not be free and fair. Right? Political parties would not be able to campaign. They would not be able to get their word out there. Action SA is a new party, brand new, launched not a few months ago. Are you not concerned about the same issue that Julius Malema is raising?
Very interesting, actually. I think about 2 hours or so ago, I received one of the messages on my social media platforms where the person was giving me advice that I must take advantage of this to be able to really mobilize. I said, my response to this individual was that our party is actually one of our core values is the rule of law. So we are not going to compromise the constitutionality of our country on the basis of us wanting to garner support. I think I believe in the rule of law. If you look at successful democracies and successful countries all over the world, they are based on the tenets of the rule of law. So I think for all of us as people of the world, including South Africa, we have to change. The new normal, we've got to adapt. It does not really mean if we used to do something yesterday or today, we'll continue doing it tomorrow. I think what is crucial here is the maintenance of the rule of law, the respect for the rule of law. So I honestly and truly don't really buy into saying free and fair elections are run on the basis of filling people in a stadium. That situation, right, under this condition are no-brainer. But at the same time, is there a way to really think out of the box as political parties to engage civil society? I believe we are not deterred. We are not really scared of facing elections as and when it is the time for South Africa to have election as per our constitution.
I mean, I hear you, but I am thinking about people in far-flung areas of our country who may not have the technologies that you and I are sharing right now. How do you propose they get to know what is happening? Both of you, either of you, any one of you can answer this question because it is a concern that South Africans have that mostly information flows in particular spaces and don't reach remote spaces in our country. What do you have to say to that? Any one of you can answer this question.
So I would think most South Africans are aware of the change in the lockdown levels.
Well, let me quickly come.
News spreads much quicker than it used to. So there are more cell phones in South Africa than there are people. That people are quite concerned about, the state of their liberties. People want to know whether they're allowed to buy cigarettes and alcohol, or what time the curfew is, and so that information spreads very quickly. And so we may find that political parties are able to get their ideas out in this manner as well. Through, if we think about the effect of social media on elections, it's just gigantic. That it's become, less useful, let's say, to have big public rallies. because it's much easier to get your message out there to a targeted audience online. So it may be that we are able to have free and fair elections without some of those in-person public gatherings like filling up a stadium. But I do think you want to ensure that, let's say, smaller political parties have the same kind of access to radio. And by the way, 14 million South Africans tune into the radio, so that they can get their ideas out there and that they're not sidelined. I mean, the other big concern about pushing out elections for 3 years is that it disadvantages new entrants. So those parties that didn't exist in the last cycle now aren't given an opportunity to compete. And it's much harder for a small party to compete in a national election. That a party might be able to get a foothold in the municipal election, which then gives them the platform to compete in the national one. And so depriving the party of the right's a problem, but it also deprives the people of the choice for those kinds of parties.
Mr. Mashaba, I know you're itching to come in here. You as your party, you want to contest the local government elections, particularly in Gauteng. You want to get your foot in certain key municipalities for the organization. What would this look like if in fact we continue with essentially an expired mandate from the electorate if elections were to be postponed?
In fact, Lerato, let me just really come in here to really show how disingenuous this call for this postponement is, talking about people in rural areas, like you've actually raised the question of elections not being free and fair. In fact, the people in the flung-out areas are the ones who are actually the biggest casualties of mismanagement and dysfunctional municipalities. Those are the people actually who deserve to have elections regularly than anything else. Because if you look at the fail of municipalities, you find them in flung-out areas, and people are totally dissatisfied with what is happening. So I think it is totally disingenuous for anyone to express the fact that you want to do this for those people, because those are the people actually who require intervention. And only intervention measure that they have at their disposal to change the political landscape is the voting. And now to deprive them of that opportunity, I believe for me, would really be criminal, it would be irrational, it would be unconstitutional. So we believe as a new entrance in this political space, would encourage the IEC, would encourage all South Africans and all the other parties to say, let us give South Africans a mandate to run this country, because ultimately democracy is dependent on civil society driving the political direction of the country.
If I could just differ slightly with my fellow panelists on this aspect. I think we should accept the fact that the new normal will indeed have an effect on the capacity of the political parties to campaign and to reach their constituencies. And hence, new innovative ways must be found in order to be able to reach out to people. It may not necessarily only be through data. Some people may not have access to data. So I'm not too sure what those mechanisms are, but it is indeed going to have an effect on the capacity of the political parties to reach their constituencies.
I mean, I was coming to that, and Mr. Mashaba, I want you to come in here, but I want you to come in here because it is an important.
I agree. No, I just wanted to let Terry, I fully agree with him that without any doubt, we, like us as a new player in the floor, we'd like to really get our over 160,000 volunteers ready to go out and work. And we discourage them every day. We warn them, say, please, we want to protect your lives and we want to protect the lives of our residents. So without any doubt, Terry, I agree fully with you that the old normal, it's unfortunately creating a problem. But then what happens for us as human beings? Let us be creative. Let's find new ways, because the old way, we don't know how long this pandemic is going to last. But at the end of the day, as human beings, God has given us the brains to find ways to navigate our challenges. It does not mean that if we've got a challenge, we are saying, no, but we used to do this for the last 100 years. No. Life has got to change, and you can see right now, as a country, as a world, we are forced to really find new ways of operating and making sure that we prosper, we grow as a country, and better the lives of our citizens.
Can we find those creative ways, though, Mr. Mashaba, in time? Because I think that's one of the contentions, right? That there isn't enough time for us to find these new ways. Can we find them in time?
Oh, well, tell me, do we have the time to change our constitutional framework? Do we have do we have the appetite to put South Africa in a constitutional crisis? Because you can imagine, you tamper with one aspect of our constitution and you don't abide by it, you've really set a very, very, very dangerous precedent. And honestly, I don't want to live in a society like this. In 1994, we voted for this democracy. 2 years later, in 1996, we passed a constitution which was hailed by the world to really be one of the most progressive. And I think if we are going to tamper with this constitution, without following due process, then I can tell you we put in the country at a much bigger risk than actually finding creative ways of dealing with our challenges.
Okay, great, gentlemen. Time is fast moving. I do want to share some of the thoughts that our viewers have. The idea is, by and large, I can tell you from the comments that I'm receiving on screen, is that most South Africans want elections to move ahead. They want to go to the polls. They want to cast their votes. They do have a concern, however, around corruption at the ballot. Mr. Tselane, there's Kabelo Muhlala here who asks, how when you were in your role at the IEC, how was corruption at the polls prevented? What confidence can we give South Africans that if we were to move ahead with elections later this year, that this could be prevented and that the election could be credible and lessen the idea of voter fraud?
The electoral process is a joint responsibility. It's a joint responsibility between those who are managing the elections and various other players. That's why it is important for political parties to have the presence at the voting station level to make sure that no irregularity happens at the voting station. But apart from the political parties having party agents at the voting station, you've got election observers as well. Their role is to make sure that they safeguard the integrity of the process. They make sure that nothing untoward or irregular happens at the voting station. So it is those mechanisms. But the legislation is structured also in such a manner that if you see anything happening at the voting station, there is something that I like about our electoral law. Section 55 from Local Electoral Act, or Section 65, because Section 65 of Municipal Electoral Act and Section 55, they mirror each other. Basically, this is what we call objections material to the outcome of the results of the elections. So a party agent, a political party, once they have seen that there is something so irregular that has actually happened, they can actually submit their objections in terms of Section 55 in national and provincial elections, or Section 65 in terms of local government elections. And then if they are not satisfied about how the commission is dealing with it, they can take it to the electoral court. Remember that independent candidates took the IEC to court after they had actually complained and they were not satisfied about how the IEC had dealt with their objection. And then indeed, the electoral court was able to uphold their objections, including the Constitutional Court. And hence, we've got the issue of the addresses and the addresses having to be attended to. So using the instruments that are there in law, it's always important. And we have been able to see that through the clockwise experience that the law, in fact, does protect the voter.
Speaking of the law, Mark, I want you to come in here. I mean, the law does state that elections must take place on a day. granted that you have the special vote happening prior to that. Would it be possible, just as a thought, and this is from the IEC perspective, could we have elections over an extended period of time, say a week, just to allow for social distancing, to allow for current COVID-19 stipulations and regulations to be meted, to be carried out? Could this be possible? Could this be done legally?
Well, it would require a change to the legislation, but of course that's different to changing the Constitution. So the Constitution talks about the five-year expiry period and within the 90 days. The legislation, which can be changed at a 51% threshold, talks about elections being held on one day. If I'm not mistaken, I think our first elections in 1994 were held over a multiple period of days to allow everyone an opportunity to vote. And you might think that is a good compromise. So I think you want to ensure that you can trust the system. And South Africa hasn't got experience with mail-in ballots, whereas America had a mail-in ballot system for a long time, and so you had ways of authenticating that. They also have a world-class postal service that South Africa doesn't have. So you might very well need in-person voting. I think there's also a question about, let's say you wanted to set up some kind of online voting system. You may have concerns about the integrity of such a system. And I think getting something like that on board could create a legitimacy crisis of its own. But the idea of staggering the election days may be the right kind of compromise.
Great. Gentlemen, we're nearing the end of our conversation, but on a lighter note, I'd just like to let you know what our viewers are thinking out there. I mean, I have, I think it's Tuto Muloi, who says, the moment you have the power to postpone elections, that means public opinion does not matter. And so, he's expressing his view around the importance of us pushing ahead. We'll find a way. I have another comment here from another one. I think Tuto's quite active, I see. He says, if we can queue at the shops for groceries, we can also queue at voting stations. Somebody, I'm going to omit who he said, must come out clear he doesn't have the funds for campaigning. That's just on a chuckle, and I'll leave that as it is. Gentlemen, in 30 seconds flat, what would you say? What advice would you give the IEC at this point, and then South Africa at large in this regard? 30 seconds. Let me start with, who do I like? Let me start with Mark.
Sure. So I would think that it's important that South Africans are aware of what the decision will be. So I think part of it is a communication challenge. So the IEC needs to say, we are going ahead. These are the measures we've taken to ensure that people will be safe, and we will ensure that our democracy survives the pandemic. I think one other little thought that's worth bearing in mind. Government has said that there will be a full vaccine rollout by the end of the year. So if vaccines are meant to be rolled out by the end of the year and our elections are held in November, then you really shouldn't have the health crisis problem with the elections. Of course, maybe government doesn't believe that it really can roll out a vaccine within that period of time. And so this might be it showing its hand.
Mr. Tselane, your 30 seconds.
I would say to the Commission that they've got to prepare to have the elections within the constitutionally stipulated period, and that they've got to cooperate with the health authorities in order to be able to observe the health protocols.
That was indeed less than 30 seconds. That was pretty sharp, Mr. Tselane. Thank you for that. Mr. Mashaba?
I would really like to make an appeal to all political parties in Parliament to please dread to live in a country where we can compromise our constitutional framework. It is too early. We are a new democracy. We're sitting with massive challenges that would require a government with a mandate to govern the country. I would really appeal to everyone, all the 400 members of Parliament, to really think about this matter very, very seriously. If anyone wants to really change the constitution, to reject it outright, please put people of South Africa first before political parties' consideration. That's really, for me, what I'd really like to appeal. We cannot afford to really put South Africa in a constitutional crisis. It would really be a disaster. We've got disasters already.
Well, that's it. Thank you so much to all of you. Thank you for your thoughts. Thank you for your time. Thank you for just illuminating some of the issues and helping us and helping South Africa ventilate, their concerns around, what this could mean, what postponing elections could mean, and that, over and above the whims of politicians, that in fact, we do have a framework with which we can work, and that, what needs to happen in our country for us to be able to move forward, we've got the wherewithal and the skills sufficient, and examples, global examples, sufficient enough for us to be able to move forward in this way. I want to thank my panelists for their time. Thank you very much. I want to thank the audience also for their questions and their comments. It's really important for us, to know what you all are thinking out there. These webinars are created in such a way and formulated in such a way that we can have, open discussion without fear or favor, and that you can hear what it is that, important people in important spaces in our countries think about these things, and that we can all share ideas together. And so this is, again, the second in the series of webinars that we will be having throughout the year. This was indeed an important conversation, and we invite all of you who are with us this evening, and including new panelists, to join us on future conversations that we will have. Thank you so very much. I want to thank the crew who are helping us behind the scenes to make this happen. It's always a challenge, particularly, Mark would know this better, that he almost had load shedding at his house this evening, but we are grateful that, we were able to have this conversation and have it as robustly as we have had. For comments, anything, as viewers out there, who are watching us this evening, we welcome your suggestions and your thoughts. Please reach out to us. You can reach us through my email address, lerato@actionsa.org.za. You are also welcome to visit our website at www.actionsa.org.za. Failing which, you can also reach us at info@actionsa.org.za. Thank you very much, South Africa.